Are you ready to launch?
I'm ready.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of Combat Life. I'm your host, Curran Jacobs, and this man I have right here on this show is one of my favorite people of all time. He's a dear friend and honestly a legend within the sport of wrestling. Honestly, I could spend 10 minutes on his introduction and highlighting all the things that he's accomplished in his life. But here it is nonetheless. This man is the leading wrestling author and historian in the world. He's been inducted in 11 Halls of Fame. He's the creator of Win Magazine. He is the creator, along with his wife Beverly Chapman, of the Dan Gable Wrestling Museum. He's also the creator of the Dan Hodge Trophy, which is the greatest honor a Division I wrestler can receive. It's like the Heisman Trophy for wrestlers. And honestly, I can't say it enough how impactful this man has been for the sport of wrestling and its history. Mike Chapman, how are you, sir?
I'm doing great, Curran, and I'm really honored to be on this telecast with you and Adam, and really looking forward to it.
Yes, I've been looking forward to this. Adam and I were just talking. Ladies and gentlemen, if you don't know, I had the honor of directing a wrestling documentary a few years ago, right in the midst of COVID. Us little ragtag group of filmmakers, along with this special gentleman, Mike Chapman, created a documentary. It encapsulates the history of wrestling and how deeply embedded it is with our society, from mixed martial arts to boxing to pro wrestling, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And Adam and I were there when you saw it for the first time, Mike, and the tears streaming down your face said it all. It meant the world to me to see that, and you said it's the best thing to happen for the sport of wrestling in the last 50 years. So how would you expand on that for our viewers?
Well, Curran, I've written 32 books, as you mentioned, and 17 have been about wrestling, and I'm really proud of the written word. I've been a newspaper journalist for 35 years, worked on some major newspapers, but the visual part of history is so important, and that's where you come in with your great background in theater. You were captain of the Michigan State wrestling team for a couple of years and had a great record, but you also got a degree in theater arts, and that gave you the background to be able to explore the opportunities that you've really begun to explore. And I really take my hat off to you and Adam to come up with that concept of the beautiful video called For the Love of Catch. And you came down and spent a couple days with me here in Newton, and we worked out a script together, and we went to Humboldt, Iowa, to the hometown of the great Frank Gotch. Then we went to Iowa City to Dan Gable's house. He took us right into his house and showed us his private training room. And we went to Carver Hawkeye Arena, which, by the way, Iowa just announced it sold out every wrestling meet this year for the fourth straight year, 13,000 tickets. We stood with Tom Brands and Terry Brands. Tom's an Olympic champ, world champ, three-time NCAA champ. His twin brother, Terry's a two-time world champ, bronze medalist in the Olympics. Then we went and met Mark Johnson, 1980 Olympian, three-time Greco-Roman national champ, and we stood on the very spot where Abe Lincoln wrestled Jack Armstrong in 1832. And Curran, I tell people, I think that's the only time that very important part of history has been captured on video. And you give me credit for coming up with most of the script, but I give you the credit for having the background and the courage to put this extremely important video out there. And I would encourage anybody with any interest in the sport of wrestling to take a look at For the Love of Catch, because I do think, Curran, it is one of the most important things, one of the most important developments in wrestling in the last 50 to 100 years.
That warms my heart to no end. I can't even explain that enough to you. And honestly, you know, it's the reception has been incredible, from wrestling fans to wrestlers to people who had no knowledge or no fan base whatsoever when it comes to the sport. And just recently, Dan the Beast Severn just came out and said every a high school wrestling team and club in America needs to see this film, and that was pretty sweet. Would you agree with his statement?
Well, I'm certainly not going to disagree with anything the Beast says. As you know, in the video, cameraman Adam Towner climbs into the ring to take on the Beast. And anybody who wants to know what pro wrestling is all about needs to look at that piece of incredible video of Adam wrestling the Beast. You know, Curran, I've known Dan Severn since he was a freshman in college. He exploded on the national scene. He was a 3-time state champ in your home state of Michigan. He won the junior nationals 3 times. He won the junior world. When he was a pure freshman, he was 28-0 with 20 pins. He pinned the defending national champion, and everybody thought he was going to be the next great Dan. I wrote a book called Two Guys Named Dan about Dan Gable and Dan Hodge. And I had written a column for Amateur Wrestling News saying I'm going to have to write a new book called Three Guys Named Dan, and that includes Dan Severn. But he blew his knee out right before the Nationals, didn't get to compete that year, ended up being a 2-time All-American. But the thing about Dan Severn, and I love to say this, he showed once and for all when he entered the UFC, the first wrestler to really have any success, that wrestling is a martial art and that wrestling is America's martial art. And after him came the great Randy Couture and Dan Henderson and Pat Miletich and so many great wrestlers. But Dan Severn opened the door and showed the world that wrestling's a bona fide martial art.
He sure did, and he loved the story I had for him, because when I got his interview, I had my son with me, who was 7 years old at the time. And I told him, I said, yep, I was my son's age when I watched you crawl into the octagon and fight Hoist Gracie. And he thought that was the coolest thing. We were rooting for him because he was a Michigander. But, talking about wrestlers and MMA, Randy the Natural Couture, another dear friend, phenomenal human being, absolute legend, the man responsible for introducing you to me, which is one of the best things that's ever could have happened, because you're just phenomenal and I love you to death. But it's so amazing because I got to be with you at the Win Show that you created with your wife Beverly just this last NCAA Division I Wrestling Championships in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And Mike, the fact that so many Olympic gold medalists, national champions, All-Americans went out of their way to seek you out and get a few moments of your time to shake your hand and give you a hug. It was eye-opening. I almost got emotional a few times seeing how much love and respect you have from these legends of the sport and the fans that you have accumulated over your career. My question for you is, over the course of your career, with everything you've accomplished, what's one thing that you look back on that gives you the most pride with everything that you've done?
Whoa, Curran, that's a tough one. I've been to 48 NCAA tournaments. Dan Gable, I saw Dan Gable wrestle in high school. I saw almost every one of his college matches. I, to this day, consider him the greatest American wrestler ever, and I can expound on that if you want me to, and there's been a lot of great ones. The 32 books I've written, 17 about wrestling, they're in the Library of Congress, so I'm very proud of that.
That's amazing.
Bev and I created Win Magazine, Wrestling Insider News Magazine, 28 years ago, and I'm very proud of that. And then when we were going to the NCAA tournament, all those years, Curran, people say, hey, well, I'll meet you down at Joe's Bar, or I'll meet you this place and that place. And it'd be a smoky place that you didn't want to bring your kids into. So in 1998, I decided to rent a space at the NCAA tournament in a big hotel. And my 2 guests were Dan Hodge and Vern Gagne, 2 of the biggest legends in amateur wrestling and pro wrestling. We had about 4 exhibitors help pick up the price tag, and we had about 600 fans show up. This last year, when you and Carissa came with us down in Tulsa, there were 22,000 people that showed up over 3 days, almost 40 exhibitors. So that's one of the things I'm proudest of, Curran, is people could come in there, between sessions of the NCAA tournament in a wonderful, clean environment. Meet legends like Dan Gable and Lee Camp and the Bannock brothers and Bruce Baumgartner and on and on and on. Barry Davis was there, 3-time NCAA champ, Olympic silver medalist. Rich Bender, the executive director of USA Wrestling, was there. Wade Chalice has been our guest before. So I'm really excited about the Win Memorabilia Show. But the Dan Hodge Trophy, I always loved the Heisman Trophy, and I thought, wouldn't it be nice if wrestling had something similar? So I created the Dan Hodge Trophy, and Dan and I, after I wrote the book, Two Guys Named Dan, about Dan Gable and Dan Hodge in 1976, Dan Hodge and I became very good friends. And his wife, Dolores, one of the sweetest women you'll ever want to meet. We stayed at their house in Perry, Oklahoma. They've stayed at our house many times. And I asked Dan, could I use his name and attach it to that trophy? Because Dan never lost in college, never was taken down. He's the only man in history to win national titles in boxing and wrestling. As you know, he could crush the handles off a pair of pliers. He could crush apples with his bare hands.
Insane.
And he had the highest hitting percentage of all time. Him and Dan Gable are neck and neck on the highest, I think it's 0.01% that separates them. And I thought Dan Hodge would be a great prototype for such an award. And Dan was very flattered and honored to do that. To this point, we have had over 1 million people see it presented in person, Curran, because our winner this year was Mason Paris, University of Michigan.
Yep.
So we present it at the wrestling banquet, usually in April, and then the athletic department wants us to present it again in the fall at halftime of a football game. So we've had crowds of over 80,000 at Penn State and Iowa and Michigan see the Dan Hodge Trophy presented. And it's also called the Heisman Trophy of Wrestling by the Associated Press. So I would say out of everything I've done, the books, Wrestling Tough, the Encyclopedia of American Wrestling, Win Magazine, probably the thing that's had the biggest impact is the Dan Hodge Trophy.
That's incredible. And it is truly something special, and 100% the highest honor a wrestler can achieve is the Dan Hodge Trophy. I always love the anticipation of it at the end of the season too. The talks like, who do you think is going to get the Dan Hodge Trophy this year, and their arguments for their specific wrestler they're rooting for. That is truly something special. And as a man,
and I actually have one sitting right around the corner. I take it with me to put it on display when I go places. I should have brought it out and sat it right next to Frank Gotch's chair. That's Frank Gotch's chair sitting behind me.
Hey.
You've sat in that chair many times yourself.
Yes, I have.
And so I think I've had 6 Olympic champions sit in that chair. Doug Bubaugh, Bill Smith, Randy Lewis, Dan Gable, Dan Hodge, people like that have all sat in that chair. And Curran Jacobs has sat in that chair.
I love it. I love it. You've witnessed some of the greatest wrestlers to ever live. You've written about them in all of your books. You're actually responsible for launching Dan Gable's name out there because you hit the press so heavily with his accomplishments back in the day and really, helped get his name out there, which was well-deserved. I would have to say your most popular series that you've written, Mike, is Wrestling Tough. And my question to you, specifically for the listeners who are primarily combat sports fans, parents, wrestlers, fighters, Wrestling Tough, what is one trait that you've discovered from all of the athletes? Yes.
Wrestling Tough with Kyle Snyder on the cover.
There it is. What is one trait? Like just one. I know there are so many that you've written in those books, but what is one that really comes to your mind that you've discovered that separates these great athletes from all the rest?
Well, Curran, that's a wonderful question, and there might be several different answers, but if I had to pin it down to one thing, as you know, I'm a devout weightlifter. I've lifted weights for 65 years. I once benched 440 pounds, weighing 205. I did compete in wrestling, judo, and sambo. I wasn't a national champion or anything like that, but I did compete in it, and I loved it. I also did some boxing, and I took karate for a year. I've always wanted to know as much as I could about combat sports. And I think the one thing, my son Jason was quite a weightlifter and a really good wrestler in high school. And I've taught a lot of young men how to lift weights. And here's what I say to him, Curran. When I walk into the weight room, I say, no electronic gizmos, nothing. When you walk into the weight room or a wrestling room, take a bow, a mental bow, and say, I'm surrendering my spirit to the weight room for the next hour and a half, or to the wrestling room for the next hour and a half. I don't care if I just had a car accident. I don't care if I just got an F and a grade point. I don't care if my girlfriend just broke up with me. For the next hour and a half, the only thing that matters to me is I surrender my spirit to wrestling or judo or sambo or weightlifting. And here's the other key I've told this to so many people. You get exactly out of life what you put into it. And is there any place that's more apparent than in a weight room or in a wrestling room? If you go in there and you give it your best, like that's why Dan Gable, he's impacted my life so much. He won 181 consecutive matches in high school and college. Then he lost to Larry Owings 13-11 in the biggest upset in collegiate sports history. I was there. I was in press row. It was at McGaw Hall Northwestern. The entire facility came to a dead halt. I saw grown men crying. Nobody knew what to do. And you know, how did Dan respond? 3 days later, he was out running 20 miles. Then he was in the weight room. Then he was in the wrestling room. Then he won the national AAU freestyle title. Then he won the Pan American Games. Then he won the World Championships. The Soviet Union, going into the 72 Olympics, said, we have one goal, to defeat Dan Gable. in the Olympics, get a load of this, Curran. In the regional trials in Iowa City, he wrestled 6 times, and he outscored the opposition 121-0 before he pinned them. I was supposed to give him the Outstanding Wrestler Award, and we couldn't find him. Somebody said he's in the sauna working out. This was after he just wrestled 6 times. I went down and got him and talked him into coming up. Then he went to the final trials of Anoka, Minnesota. He outscored them 78-1. He's still angry about that 1 point. He claims the other wrestler didn't really score. Then, with a bad left knee, he enters the Olympic Games. And the Soviets said, our number one goal is to beat Dan Gable. He wrestles 6 times and gives up 0 points. So in his last 19 matches against the greatest wrestlers in America and the world, he gave up 1 point.
Unprecedented.
We'll never see anything like that again. There's other great wrestlers. El Sanderson's one of my favorite wrestlers. The Bannock Boys, on and on and on. Randy Lewis, Barry Davis, all these great wrestlers. But to me, Dan is the epitome of my philosophy, which is you get exactly out of it what you put into it. The time and the hours he spent in a wrestling room. And like Muhammad Ali said, I don't win in the ring when I'm boxing. I win in the hundreds of hours I spend training to get into the boxing ring.
So there is no substitute for the mental discipline and just commitment to your craft 100%. And like you said, so what I gathered from that is dedicating your spirit, no excuses, nothing at all, giving it 100% day in and day out. And with that said, Mike, what if you had one message for the youth wrestlers across the country, would you have anything to add on to that for them within this message?
Yeah, and this is a little bit self-serving, but please forgive me. I've written a book called Legends of the Mat, and on the cover is Dan Gable, Bruce Baumgartner, who won 18 national titles, the great John Smith, 6-time world champion, the great Doug Blubaugh, 1960 Olympic champion. And it's got the biographies of 34 of the greatest wrestlers in American history. And they're short, 3 to 4 pages each. Current. I wrote that book to inspire young people to read the stories of Lee Kemp or Dan Gable or John Smith or Bruce Baumgartner. The Schultzes. I was really good friends with Mark Schultz and Dave Schultz, to understand what it takes to be that good. And it's not for everybody. I don't think I had it in me to be a world or Olympic champion because I've got too many other interests. I care about the Trojan War, 1186 BC, as you know.
Absolutely.
I'm a huge fan of Davy Crockett. I'm a big fan of George Washington. I've got Abraham Lincoln stuff all over my house. So I had too many interests to really devote myself but I've always devoted myself to trying to popularize the sport and teach people about the great legends of the sport. That was my role, Curran.
I read the book, and ladies and gentlemen, I've got to tell you, all your work is phenomenal, but for that book specifically that you just raised up, it does tell you all you need to know if you are yearning for success on the mat, or any combat sport for that matter. But Mike Chapman, it's an honor to have you on. I think you're absolutely wonderful, and honestly, I can't say it enough. Such a staple in the sport of wrestling. All the history that you have preserved and maintained throughout the years is truly unprecedented. Everything you and your wife Beverly have done throughout the years is just appreciated by so many. Not just the legends that I saw at the NCAA tournament either, but all the fans. And you're so gracious and humble and a loving person. I think the world of you, and I really appreciate you taking the time to come on the show and talk to us.
Well, we've hardly even talked about Frank Gotch, so we can do that at another time. I do think he's the greatest overall wrestler who ever lived. That's his chair right behind me as we talked about it. Sat in his house in Humboldt, Iowa, till the day he died in 1917. And I'm going to tell, when I sign off here, to tell people, I've always dreamed of having a movie made about the life story of Frank Gotch. And ever since I met you, thanks to Randy Cotier, the three of us meeting with our agents in Hollywood, talking about a movie called The Grappler. As soon as I met you, I said, there's the perfect guy to play Frank Gotch. And someday, Curran, we're going to get that done. After seeing you in the movie Silent Night in Algona and the way you handled yourself in For the Love of Catch, you need to make the movie on the story of Frank Gotch.
That is definitely on the bucket list, my friend. And I 100% believe we're going to get that happening and getting it done. Love you so much, Mr. Chapman. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, stay tuned. Not only for what's upcoming in the future, but stay tuned to this man here, as he is going to appear again at the 2024 National Championships. He'll be at the Win Show. From all of us here at
in Kansas City, Kansas, the last weekend of March.
That's right, Kansas City.
I want you to be our special guest again, and we're going to have some more special guests.
It would be an absolute honor. I had a blast the last time, and I can only imagine how much fun we'll have this time around. But from all of us at Combat Life, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for tuning in. We'll see you next time.